Your tree has been removed. It was cited under Section 4.7 of the Cedar Brook Pines Community Standards, unauthorized vegetation exceeding permitted canopy height. The HOA acted within its authority. Any concerns may be directed to the board in writing. She said it, standing at the edge of my gravel drive, clipboard in hand, reading the words the way someone reads something they have already decided cannot be challenged. The morning air carried the smell of fresh sawdust, a clean and terrible smell, and I stood looking at the place where the oak had been. 200 years, give or take, by the county forester's estimate. My grandfather Elias had nailed a tin marker to its bark in 1962, and before him his own father had tied a rope swing from the lowest limb that hung over the pond. The stump was still bleeding sap, pale and slow, and the smell of it cut through everything else. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're from, and if something like this has ever happened to you, I want to hear it. What Diane Hartwell, Cedar Brook Pines HOA Vice President, Compliance Chair, and the woman standing in my drive did not know, and what she had not thought to check, was that the water supply line feeding every tap, every faucet, every irrigation head in the Cedar Brook Pines development ran beneath my land. The easement for that line sat in a recorded document at the county assessor's office. The line itself crossed 42 feet of ground I had owned outright since my grandmother's estate closed in 2003. I had never mentioned it. There had been no reason to mention it. There was a reason now. The oak had stood for 2 centuries, and she had it taken down in an afternoon. Stay with this one. Every detail here is placed for a reason. The land came to me through my father's mother, Eleanor Whitfield, who received it from her own father, a man named Elias Holt, who had worked it as a truck farm and a timber operation beginning in 1934. 4 generations, 112 acres in the hill country east of Millbrook, Tennessee, and the deed had never left the family. Elias had bought the original parcel at a county land auction for $148 and had paid the taxes every year without missing one, through the Depression and through the war and through the long drought years of the early 1950s, when the creek in the lower pasture ran so thin you could step across it. He had earned it in the particular way that land can be earned, not dramatically, but incrementally, through the slow accumulation of small acts. The fence post driven in hard ground, the culvert dug before the fall rains came, the tax receipt folded and placed in the tin box on the kitchen shelf. My father used to say that Elias treated his land the way a man treats a good tool, with steady attention and without sentimentality. I understood that now in a way I had not understood it as a young man. The property itself ran from the county road at its northern boundary down through mixed hardwood and cedar to a stock pond and then south into an open meadow that had once been pastured but now grew in tall grass and wildflowers through the summer months. The oak had stood, at the meadow's northern edge, roughly 60 yards from the house, on a low knoll that caught the afternoon light. I had measured it once with a tape around its circumference, 9 feet 3 inches. The forester who examined it for a property survey I'd commissioned in 2018 estimated its age at between 190 and 215 years, which placed its germination sometime around the early years of the 19th century, before Tennessee had been a state for 20 years. It was not a decorative tree. It was a fact of the land, as fixed and documentary as the deed itself. Cedar Brook Pines had been developed in 2007 on adjacent acreage to the west, carved out of a parcel that had once belonged to the Drummond family and sold to a developer named Stanton Capital when the Drummond heirs could not agree on what to do with it. The development went in over about 3 years. 54 homes, a clubhouse, a common pool, a set of CC and RS that ran to 61 pages. I had read them when the development was first announced, not out of suspicion but out of the same habit of attention that Elias had practiced. The CC and RS governed the Cedar Brook Pines lots. They said so explicitly in their jurisdictional language. The properties described in Exhibit A of the Declaration of Covenants. My land was not in Exhibit A. It had never been submitted to the HOA's jurisdiction, never annexed, never encumbered by their covenants. I was not a member of the association. I had no obligation to comply with their rules about canopy height or vegetation management or any other matter. I knew this the same way I knew the property lines, because I had read the documents. Diane Hartwell had been elected to the HOA board in 2019 and appointed compliance chair shortly thereafter. I had met her once before, at a county planning commission meeting where she had spoken about an extension of the Cedars Brook Pines stormwater easement. She was a composed and practiced speaker, the kind of person who read their statements from prepared notes and who seemed to believe that authority followed from the performance of authority, that if you spoke with sufficient certainty, the legal foundation would arrange itself beneath you. She had moved to Cedar Brook Pines from a suburb outside Nashville, and she brought with her a set of assumptions about how residential communities worked that may have been entirely accurate in that context and were entirely inapplicable to mine. The first letter had arrived 18 months before she cut down the oak. It was a standard compliance notice printed on Cedar Brook Pines HOA letterhead, citing Section 4.2 of the Community Standards, Vegetation Management, and requiring that I address the encroachment of native tree canopy from the adjacent property. The letter referred to my land as the adjacent property, which told me everything I needed to know about the assumptions underlying it. I had read the letter twice and set it on the kitchen table and thought about it. I did not respond. The second letter came 6 weeks later. This one cited Section 7.1, Nuisance Provisions, and added a proposed fine of $250 for noncompliance. It also referenced a board resolution passed at the previous month's meeting, which purported to extend HOA enforcement authority to adjacent properties affecting the aesthetic character of the Cedar Brook Pines community. I read that resolution language 3 times. I read it with the particular attention you give to something that is either very confused or very bold. There was no legal instrument cited in support of it. No easement, no annexation agreement, no covenant. Just a board resolution, passed by 4 people, extending their authority over land they had no legal interest in. I wrote the date on the letter and placed it in the file folder I had already labeled neatly with the name of the development. I did not hire a lawyer yet. Not then. I wanted to understand the full shape of the thing before I responded to any part of it. The third letter arrived in the spring. Certified mail, return receipt requested. Diane Hartwell had signed it herself. It cited the oak specifically. The large heritage oak situated at the property boundary, and declared it a hazard tree under Section 4.7 of the Community Standards, a designation it claimed triggered the HOA's right to abate the hazard at the property owner's expense. It gave me 30 days to have the tree removed, or the HOA would contract the removal and bill me for it. The fine had grown to $800. The letter included a photograph of the oak taken from the Cedar Brook Pines side of the boundary, on a day when the canopy was full and the afternoon light came through it in long slanted bars. It was a beautiful photograph, almost inadvertently. The tree was in no way a hazard. It had stood on that knoll through 2 centuries of Tennessee weather and showed none of the structural failure indicators: crown dieback, root upheaval, trunk cavity, bark separation, that a qualified arborist would look for. I had walked to it the morning the letter arrived and put my hand against its bark, which was rough and dark and slightly warm from the sun, and I had stood there for a while listening to the meadow. I called a friend of mine named Ray Gideon, who had spent 30 years as a licensed land surveyor in the county and who had surveyed my property twice. Once in 2003 when my grandmother's estate closed, and again in 2018. Ray was a lean, careful man who spoke slowly and did not embellish. I asked him to run the boundary line at the Oaks location with precision, using the recorded monuments from the 2018 survey. He came out on a Thursday morning with his equipment and spent 4 hours on the line. When he was done, he showed me on his field notes where the boundary ran. The oak, all of it, trunk, root base, every inch of it, sat 11 feet inside my property line. Not at the boundary, not ambiguous, 11 feet inside. I made a copy of Ray's field notes and added them to the folder. Then I did something I had been thinking about since the second letter. I went to the county assessor's office and pulled the plat map for the Cedar Brook Pines development. I asked for the recorded easement index for all parcels in Township 14, Range 6 East, which was the section that included both the development and my land. The clerk, a woman named Mrs. Coates, who had worked in that office for 22 years and who had helped me pull records before, set a stack of copied documents on the counter and left me with them. I worked through them for about 2 hours. The water supply easement was recorded in 2008, the year after the Cedar Brook Pines development was completed. It granted the Millbrook County Water Authority and the Cedar Brook Pines development a right-of-way for a 6-inch water main crossing, specifically crossing a 42-foot corridor of what was described in the easement document as Holt Whitfield Parcel 14-6-112, which was the tax parcel designation for my land. The easement had a term. It was not permanent. It had been granted for 30 years, running from 2008 through 2038, and it contained a standard utilities easement condition that I had read in other documents before. Continued right-of-way was contingent upon the easement holder not taking any action materially adverse to the interests of the grantor parcel. I read that condition twice. I wrote it down on a notepad in my own handwriting. Then I looked up the grantor signature on the easement document. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, had signed it in March of 2008, 5 years before she died. She had signed it as a neighborly accommodation, as was her nature, and she had filed the original in her records, which had passed to me with the estate. I drove home with a full copy of the easement and added it to the folder, which was getting thick. The oak had not been touched yet, but I could feel the shape of what was coming, and I was not in a hurry. The letter I received in late October was not certified mail. It was hand-delivered, placed in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning by a contractor Diane Hartwell had hired. The oak was gone by noon. I heard the chainsaws from the house, and I walked out and stood at a distance and watched it happen. The crew was professional and worked quickly. The trunk came down in 3 sections. The stump grinder came in last and took the base down to about 4 inches above the soil. By the time they finished, the The knoll where the oak had stood for 2 centuries looked scraped and pale and diminished, and the meadow felt wider without it, and not in a way that was an improvement. Diane pulled up in her car as the crew was loading the last of the wood. She walked over to me and read from her clipboard in the manner I have already described. "Your tree has been removed," she said. "The HOA acted within its authority." She did not ask how I was. She did not acknowledge that she had just taken down a 200-year-old tree on land she had no legal interest in. She turned and walked back to her car, and I stood looking at the stump, and the sap was still seeping from the cut surface, slow and clear in the October light. I went inside and took the folder from the shelf. I sat at the kitchen table with the easement document, the plat map, Ray Gideon's survey notes, the 3 compliance letters, and the copy of the Cedar Brook Pines C&Rs open in front of me. I had not raised my voice to Diane Hartwell. I had not threatened anything. I had not needed to. The documents on my table, arranged in the order I had collected them, told a story that was complete and unambiguous, and the next step belonged not to me, but to the record. I called a property law attorney named Howard Breck, who had an office in Millbrook and who had handled my grandmother's estate. I had not spoken to him in several years, but his manner had not changed, measured and precise with a quality of attention that reminded me of Ray Gideon. I told him what had happened in the order it had happened. I told him about the easement. He was quiet for a moment. "The tree was on your property," he said. "Not at the line. Not ambiguous." I told him it was 11 feet inside. He was quiet again. "And the water main easement, you have the original recorded document?" I told him I had a certified copy from the county. "All right," he said, "let me look at the easement language." I drove the folder to his office the following morning and left it with him. He called me back in 3 days. The easement condition language was exactly what I had read. Howard said it plainly. The removal of the oak, which had stood at the northern edge of the meadow and whose root system had been documented in the 2018 survey as extending to the easement corridor, constituted a material alteration to the grantor parcel. Combined with the HOA's prior written assertions of authority over land outside their recorded jurisdiction, authority they had exercised in removing the tree, the easement's contingency clause had been triggered. The right-of-way was not automatically terminated, but the grounds existed to file for a declaratory judgment that the adverse action clause had been violated and to seek injunctive relief on the easement's continued operation. Howard used the phrase "legally cut off their water supply" with the same tone a man might use to describe a clause in a contract, which is exactly what it was. He filed the initial motion with the circuit court on a Thursday, 17 days after the oak came down. The water main beneath my land continued to flow. For now. Howard Breck was not a man who used the word significant loosely. He had spent 26 years in property law in Millbrook County, and in that time he had developed a habit of economy with language that I had always respected. The same economy, I sometimes thought, that my grandfather Elias had brought to his work on the land, where a word meant what it meant and nothing else. So, when Howard called me on a Wednesday morning in mid-November, while the frost was still on the meadow grass and the stump of the oak was pale and exposed against the brown field, and he said, "I want you to understand what this survey situation is beginning to look like because it is significant." I put down my coffee and listened with my full attention. The circuit court had accepted the initial motion. Howard had filed for a declaratory judgment on the easement's conditional clause, and the court had assigned a hearing date in January. But in preparing the motion, Howard had done something I had not specifically asked him to do, which was pull the full recorded plat history of the Cedar Brook Pines development from the county register's office. Not just the easement documents I had already gathered, but the underlying subdivision plat, the boundary certifications, the recorded surveys that had accompanied the 2007 development application. He had set one of his clerks to work on it, a young woman named Patrice, who had a methodical quality that Howard said made her particularly good at plat research. It was Patrice who found the discrepancy. The Cedar Brook Pines development plat, recorded in 2007, showed the development's eastern boundary running along a line that had been established by a private survey commissioned by Stanton Capital, the developer. That survey had placed the boundary line approximately 9 feet east of where it actually sat according to the county's original township section monuments. The township monuments were the controlling authority. They were federal survey monuments set during the original General Land Office survey of the region in the 1880s, and they did not move and were not subject to revision by a private developer's surveyor. Ray Gideon had located and verified both of the relevant monuments during his 2018 survey of my property. The Stanton Capital Survey had not used those monuments. It had used, instead, a set of iron pins that had been placed during an earlier boundary survey of the Drummond parcel. Pins that were themselves offset from the GLO monuments by the same 9 feet, an error that had propagated silently through the chain of title since the Drummond survey had first been recorded in 1979. What this meant, in practical terms, was that the Cedar Brook Pines development had been built 9 feet further east than its plat legally permitted. The eastern boundary of the development, the boundary nearest my land, the boundary that Diane Hartwell and her board had treated as the operational line between her jurisdiction and mine, was 9 feet inside my property, 9 feet running the full length of the shared boundary, which was approximately 340 linear feet. I did the math myself, sitting at the kitchen table while Howard walked me through it. A strip of land measuring 9 feet wide and 340 feet long, amounting to just over 3,000 square feet, had been treated by the Cedar Brook Pines development for 17 years as though it belonged to them. A portion of the development's perimeter landscaping sat on it. A section of the decorative cedar rail fence that marked the HOA's boundary sat on it, and a small concrete pad and utility cabinet which served as the access point for the water main that ran beneath my land sat on it. Howard paused when he got to the utility cabinet. I did not say anything. He said, "You understand what this means for the easement argument?" I told him I did. The error was not fraud, or at least there was no evidence of intentional fraud. It was the kind of error that happened when a developer's survey crew worked from inadequate reference points, and when the county's plat review process did not catch the discrepancy at the time of recording, and when no adjacent landowner had cause to challenge the boundary because no one had been paying close enough attention. My grandmother, Eleanor, had not challenged it. She had not, as far as I knew, been aware of it. The 2003 estate survey had established her boundary correctly relative to the GLO monuments, but she had not compared that result to the Cedar Brook Pines plat, which had not yet been recorded. She had simply kept her land and gone about her life, and the 9-foot discrepancy had sat in the recorded documents, invisible and consequential, for 17 years. I drove out to the boundary line that afternoon and walked it. The frost had softened by then, and the ground was damp under my boots, and I could smell the cold clay and the fallen leaves, and the faint sourness of the creek that ran along the lower edge of the meadow. The cedar rail fence was well built. The rails set in mortised posts, the posts set deep, the kind of construction that was meant to last. I put my hand on one of the posts and felt the grain of the cedar, which was dry and slightly aromatic even in the cold. Someone had built this fence to mark a line they believed was theirs. They had been wrong by 9 feet, and neither they nor anyone in the 17 years since had thought to verify it against the original monuments. I found the GLO monument on my side of the line, a square iron post set in concrete, its top marked with a brass cap that carried the survey designation numbers, in a thicket of blackberry canes about 30 feet south of the fence line. I had known it was there because Ray had noted it in his 2018 field notes. I cleared the canes back with my boot and looked at the cap. The numbers on it matched Ray's notes exactly. The fence was 9 feet away. The fence was wrong. I went back to my truck and sat for a while. The meadow had gone to a pale winter gold in the afternoon light, and a pair of Canada geese were moving slowly along the near edge of the stock pond, picking at the frost-flattened grass. The pond had been there since Elias's time, dug by hand and mule over the course of a summer in 1941, and he had stocked it with bass and let the mallards come as they would. My father had fished it every spring with a cane pole, and I had fished it with him. The geese on the pond and the fence 9 feet from where it should have been, and the brass survey cap and the blackberry canes were all, in their different ways, part of the same document, the document of this land and its history. And that document, like all the others I had been collecting, said the same thing, plainly and without ambiguity. I added Patrice's research memo and the GLO monument coordinates to the folder. Howard filed an amended motion the following week that added the boundary discrepancy to the declaratory judgment petition, citing the 1880s GLO monuments as the controlling boundary authority and requesting that the court order a formal boundary establishment proceeding under Tennessee Code, annotated Section 16-1-114, which governed disputed boundary determinations. He also added a quiet title, cause of action with respect to the 3,000-square-foot strip. The water main easement argument was still in the filing. It had simply been joined by something larger and older and more fundamental. The paperwork, by that point, had a weight to it that had nothing to do with the number of pages. The hearing date in January arrived cold and clear, the kind of Tennessee winter morning when the sky is a flat, thin blue, and the ground is iron hard underfoot and sound carries strangely, as though the cold has made the air more precise. I drove into Millbrook along the county road past the cedar and oak stands that Elias had left standing when he thinned the timber. He had always left the big ones, he had said, because the big ones were what made the property what it was, and they would be worth more standing over time than they would ever be worth as lumber. I thought about that on the drive, the way I often thought about things he had said when I was on that road. Howard met me in the courthouse parking lot. He was carrying his briefcase and wearing a charcoal overcoat that he had probably owned for 15 years. And he had the field notes and the plat copies and the certified survey documents organized in a red accordion folder under his arm. Patrice had prepared a comparison exhibit: the Cedar Brook Pines plat, the Stanton Capital Survey, the GLO monument coordinates, and Ray Gideon's 2018 survey, all overlaid on a single-scale drawing that showed, clearly and without any need for explanation, the 9-foot discrepancy running the full length of the shared boundary. Howard had submitted the exhibit to the court 3 weeks before the hearing. I had asked him how he thought the other side would respond to it, and he had said, with his characteristic economy, "They don't have a survey that contradicts it." They did not. Cedar Brook Pines was represented by a property attorney from Nashville named Gareth Poole, a capable man who had clearly spent the weeks between the filing and the hearing trying to find grounds to challenge the boundary argument. He had commissioned a new survey from a firm in Knoxville. That survey, which Poole submitted as the HOA's exhibit, had located the same GLO monuments that Ray Gideon had located and had produced the same result. His own survey confirmed the 9-foot discrepancy. He knew it before the hearing began because he had to have known it. You do not submit a survey exhibit without reading it. But he came to the hearing anyway, and I respected that, in the way you can respect a man's professionalism, even when his client's position has already been resolved by the evidence. The circuit court judge was a woman named Honorable Patricia Stiles, who had been on the bench for 11 years and who had a reputation, among the attorneys who practiced in her court, for reading every document in a filing before the hearing began. She had read ours. I could tell from the quality of her questions when Howard presented the survey comparison exhibit. She asked about the method for establishing priority between a private development survey and the GLO monuments. And Howard cited the applicable Tennessee case law, Whitson versus McMinn County, a 1991 decision that had established the GLO monuments as the controlling authority in any boundary dispute where they were identifiable and intact. Judge Stiles nodded as though she had already located the case in her pre-hearing research, which she probably had. Poole argued that the boundary error, if it was an error, had been ratified by 17 years of open, continuous use. Adverse possession, essentially. Howard had anticipated this. He cited the same section of Tennessee law that governed adverse possession claims against record owners who had paid continuous property taxes on the disputed parcel which I had. The taxes on every square foot of my land, including the 9-foot strip, had been paid every year since my grandmother's estate closed, just as Elias had paid them before her, without missing one. The tax receipts were in the record. Poole did not press the adverse possession argument long. Judge Stiles issued a bench ruling at the end of the hearing, declining to reach a final judgment on all counts on that day, but granting Howard's request for an immediate survey order, directing that a court-appointed surveyor establish the boundary by the GLO monuments within 60 days, and issuing a temporary restraining order prohibiting Cedar Brook Pines and its HOA from taking any action on, altering, or asserting ownership interest in the disputed strip pending resolution of the boundary proceeding. The water main easement issue, she said, would be addressed at a subsequent hearing after the boundary was legally established, because the easement's legal character depended on where the boundary sat. She said, "The controlling authority in this matter is the original General Land Office survey, and the court intends to apply it." Howard and I walked out into the cold January air together. He folded the accordion binder under his arm and said nothing for a moment. I looked at the bare oak and sycamore trees along the courthouse square and thought about the knoll back home, scrubbed and pale, and the geese on the pond that morning before I left. Howard said, "That went about as well as it could go." I told him I thought so. We shook hands in the parking lot, and I drove home along the county road, past the cedars Elias had left standing, into the afternoon light that was already going thin and gold above the ridge. The court-appointed surveyor came out 6 weeks later. His name was Dan Pruitt, and he had been doing survey work in the county for nearly 30 years. He located both GLO monuments within the first hour, confirmed their condition and designation markings, and ran the boundary line by the numbers. When he was done, He drove a fresh set of survey stakes along the true line, and one of those stakes stood 9 feet east of the cedar rail fence that Cedar Brook Pines had built to mark what they had believed was theirs. Dan Pruitt filed his report with the circuit court the following week. The numbers in it were the same numbers Ray Gideon had given me 5 years before. The land did not change because someone finally measured it correctly. It had always been exactly where it was. The second hearing was set for the 3rd week of March, and by then the court-appointed survey was in the record and Dan Pruitt's stakes were still in the ground along the true boundary line, orange flagging on each one, visible from the county road on a clear day if you knew where to look. The meadow had begun to show the first thin green of early spring beneath the winter dead grass, and the stock pond was full from the February rains, and the stump of the oak on the knoll was weathering to gray at its edges, the sap long since dried, the exposed wood beginning its slow return to the soil. I had planted a white oak seedling 6 feet from the stump, a 2-year-old sapling from the county extension nursery, its trunk no thicker than my thumb. It would not be what the old tree had been in my lifetime or in my children's lifetimes, but it was in the ground, on my land, and it was alive, and that was its own kind of statement. Howard called me the week before the second hearing to tell me that Gareth Poole had filed a settlement inquiry. The HOA board, not Diane Hartwell alone, but the full board, which suggested to me that someone on it had obtained independent legal advice, was proposing to stipulate to the boundary as established by Dan Pruitt's survey, to vacate their written assertions of authority over my property, and to pay my documented legal costs and the cost of the court-appointed survey. In exchange, they wanted the easement issue resolved by renegotiation rather than court order, so that the water main beneath my land could remain operational under a new, correctly drawn easement agreement with proper terms and a proper grantor acknowledgement. Howard laid it out plainly and then was quiet, which was his way of telling me the decision was mine. I sat with it for an afternoon. I walked the boundary line again, following the orange-flagged stakes, and I stood for a while at the corner monument, the brass-capped iron post and the blackberry canes, and I thought about what my grandfather Elias would have made of all of it. He had not been a litigious man. He had not been a man who needed to see his adversaries ruined. What he had needed, and what he had always insisted upon, was that the line be in the right place, that the record reflect the truth of the land, exactly and without accommodation. The settlement gave me that. It gave me the boundary on the record, the vacated claims, the corrected easement, the costs. It gave me the paper. I called Howard back that evening and told him I would accept the terms, provided the new easement was drafted with the adverse action clause restored and strengthened, and provided that the boundary stipulation was entered as a court judgment, not merely a private agreement. Howard said he would insist on both conditions. He did. The second hearing was brief. Judge Stiles reviewed the settlement terms, confirmed that both the boundary stipulation and the easement renegotiation framework would be entered as a court order, and signed the judgment from the bench. The operative language of the order read in part that the eastern boundary of the Cedar Brook Pines planned unit development is hereby established and recorded in conformity with the General Land Office monuments as identified and verified by the court-appointed surveyor, and all prior boundary certifications inconsistent with this establishment are hereby vacated of record. The quiet title cause of action on the 3,000-square-foot strip was resolved in the same document. The strip was mine. It had always been mine. The court had simply written it down in a way that would follow the deed forever. Diane Hartwell was not in the courtroom. I had not expected her to be. She had resigned from the HOA board in February, 2 weeks after the amended motion was filed and the boundary discrepancy became public knowledge in the way that court filings become public knowledge. I did not know the details of her departure, and I did not seek them. The board that remained had voted, according to the county legal notices, to engage an independent property attorney to review all of the HOA's boundary-related documents going forward. That seemed like a reasonable decision. It was, in a way, the decision they should have made before the first letter ever left their office. The legal costs the HOA paid, surveying fees, Howard's hours, the court-appointed surveyor's fee, filing costs, came to a little over $14,000. Howard had documented every item. The check came through Poole's office, and I deposited it without ceremony. I used a portion of it to have the cedar rail fence on the true boundary line removed and replaced with a simple wire fence set on wooden posts, the kind of fence Elias would have recognized at the correct location. The decorative cedar rails the HOA had built on my land were hauled away. The concrete utility cabinet that had sat on my strip was relocated to a point inside the development's corrected boundary. The new easement was drafted, executed, and recorded, with the adverse action clause present and explicit, and the grantor parcel properly identified, and the term running 25 years from the date of recording. Everything was where it belonged. I went out to the knoll on the morning after the new fence was set. The air smelled of turned earth and new grass and the faint iron smell of the stock pond in early spring, and the Canada geese were back on the water, 3 of them moving slowly along the near bank in the early light. The stump of the old oak was to my left, gray and beginning to soften at its edges, and the seedling was to my right, its new spring leaves small and pale and trembling slightly in the morning air. I put my hand on the seedling's stake and stood there for a while. The meadow ran south from where I stood, the way it always had, down toward the pond and the willow stand and the lower pasture, and the boundary fence ran east to west behind me, the posts set plumb and true on the line that Dan Pruitt's stakes had marked and that the brass survey cap and the blackberry canes had always confirmed. The land was as it had been. The record now said so clearly. What I had learned, or perhaps confirmed, through all of it, was something that Elias had understood in his bones without ever having needed to articulate it, something that the documents had shown me plainly once I knew how to read them together. When an institution with apparent authority makes a claim against you, when it arrives with letterhead and citations and the practiced confidence of a person accustomed to compliance, the first and only question worth asking is whether that claim has a legal foundation. Not whether the institution believes it, not whether the claim sounds authoritative, not whether the institution has the resources to make your life difficult while the question is being answered. The question is whether the foundation exists, and the answer to that question is always, without exception, in the record. The deed, the plat, the monument, the easement, the survey. The paper that was filed in a county office and given a book and page number and left there, unchanged and unchallengeable, for anyone willing to go and read it. Diane Hartwell had not read it. She had assumed. She had performed authority so fluently that I think she had convinced herself it was the same thing as having it. It was not. It had never been. And the record, which does not care about performance or confidence or the weight of a clipboard, had said so in the only language that matters in a dispute over land. I kept the folder. It sits on the shelf in my study now, organized in the order I assembled it, The certified easement copy behind the survey notes, behind the plat map, behind the 3 compliance letters, behind the CC and Rs with the jurisdictional language underlined in pencil. I do not anticipate needing it again. But Elias kept his tax receipts in a tin box on the kitchen shelf for 40 years, not because he expected trouble, but because he understood that the record was the thing, that the land and the record of the land were, in the end, the same document. I understood that now in a way that went deeper than knowledge. The oak seedling on the knoll will take 80 years to cast real shade, maybe more. Someone else will sit under it some day, the way my father had sat under the old one as a boy, and they will not think about county records or easement clauses or the name of any compliance chair. They will think about the light through the leaves and the sound of the pond and the way the meadow looks in late afternoon when the grass goes gold. That is as it should be. The land will outlast all of this the way it has always outlasted everything else. If any of this sounds familiar, a boundary dispute, an HOA letter, an old survey that didn't match the deed, leave it in the comments. There is more to these stories than people talk about, and I find them worth telling carefully. If you want to hear the next one, the subscribe button is there, and I will leave the light on.